Hello, this is Hakan Öniz from ICOMOS UCH. This is the ninth part of ICOMOS Underwater Cultural Heritage Webinar. We have two distinguished speakers, and we have many strong colleagues from different parts of the world. To read the biography of Hans, I would like to invite Chris. Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Hakan. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Hans and read to you and inform you about his background. Hans was a geography major at the University of California, Berkeley, received a Master of Arts, MA, from East Carolina University's Maritime Program and PhD from the University of Hawaii, where he ran a program in maritime archaeology and history. He is currently the Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the NOAA's Marine Sanctuary Office in the Pacific Islands region. Hans has served as consultant for UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage Program, a co-instructor for UNESCO Underwater Cultural Heritage Foundation courses, and is co-chair for the Asia Pacific Regional Conference on Underwater Cultural Heritage. Welcome, Hans. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. And let me share the screen then. Have you got the title slide in front of you?
Yes. I have, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for making time today. This is about intangible cultural heritage in the Pacific and some thoughts about that. And it's a privilege to get to present this topic. To begin, let's just take a look at a couple of the familiar definitions to put us in the spirit of the subject. And this is, of course, from the UNESCO definition. Intangible cultural heritage includes traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants. Oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, and knowledge concerning nature and the universe. So in this, and concerning traditional crafts, so in this, we see actions, practices, knowledge, and objects as well. And another that we're probably familiar with, the ICOMOS definition, intangible cultural heritage, within any associated cultural space includes practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, etc. And these values are related to identity and belief and symbolism in nature and the environment. So again, actions, practices with locations, with objects related to identity. Important to point out. I think that as archaeologists, we tend to see locations, structures, features, typically from the tangible side, almost by automatic reaction. And we forget that for many other people, this is not just about the property itself, the tangible aspect, but this is a location of significant ceremony and practice. This is an example from Hawaii, one of the heiau, the temples above the bay, where practices are conducted today, of course. And let's not forget that for our own obsession with shipwrecks and UCH and tangible culture, we too have a set of package of beliefs and traditions and behaviors. I mean, the archaeological and historical significance of what we're looking at are themselves intangible values of these properties and locations. And then we often return to our office after projects and we carry out our own arcane rituals of academic advancement and publication. So whether we remember it or not, we are involved in tangible and intangible aspects already of what we do. Now, for my office, I work for NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in the United States. We are mandated to consider both the tangible and intangible aspects of historical, archaeological, and cultural resources. And the realm of intangible cultural heritage in the Pacific is, of course, incredibly vast. And I cannot, give any kind of comprehensive survey in a brief talk, of course. I don't think anyone could, but I can talk about a little bit about what I know. And I've worked in the Hawaiian Islands and in American Samoa. And so I'll discuss a few examples from our sanctuaries in the Pacific about intangible cultural heritage from those places. This is an example of the cultural connection between both land and the deep ocean. This map is showing designations of the Hawaiian landscape. And for people in Hawaii, there's often little distinction between the natural and cultural spaces, the environment. Marine spaces as terrestrial spaces can be known and valued. And sometimes I think it's frustrating for people here when we federal managers talk about distinguishing between natural and cultural resources. The two are very closely related in Hawaii. The first example I want to give you of intangible cultural heritage in the Pacific comes from Hawaii and is the Kumulipo, is drawn from the creation chant of the Hawaiian people. And now I'm not an expert, but in my understanding, the Kumulipo is an oral tradition which explains the nature of creation and the universe. And it was first recorded by Westerners in the 18th century. This genealogy of the ancient Hawaiian ali'i, the chiefs themselves, was passed down through oral tradition in the Kumulipo. And it begins with the marine species like the limu, the seaweed, and the corals, the marine environment itself. People and species and the environment are part of this same creation from this point of view. So it should be no surprise that people still believe that Amakua, or personal family gods that originated as deified ancestors, can take the physical form of sharks, turtles, octopus, birds, etc., even inanimate objects. So the values of this Kumulipo creation chant are directly related to identity, memory, remembrance, belief, and symbolism, and nature and the environment. And so that should sound familiar. Those are words that were captured in the definitions of intangible cultural heritage. That heritage that is relational between people, species, and the marine environment. The second example of intangible cultural heritage in Hawaii is Pacific traditional navigation. The boldest maritime migration in our history, the peopling of the Pacific, came about through the maintenance of a coherent and intact cultural package of knowledge, which had been developed over hundreds of years. Navigation by ocean waypoints of current and swell, seabird migration, cloud formation, celestial navigation, star navigation, these skills being passed down all through training and oral tradition are that knowledge package. And in our time, there are, several individuals that were directly responsible for that. This is a picture of Nainoa Thompson. He is the chief navigator for the Polynesian Voyaging Society. He's second on the right there on stage, second from the right. And he learned from Maupi Ailog, the Micronesian navigator whom he contacted and revived the Polynesian and the Hawaiian voyaging skills in the 70s and the 80s. So very central to this intangible heritage. And of course, that heritage continues today in activity, in practice. Here is the Hokulea, the voyaging canoe, replica voyaging canoe, being launched on her worldwide voyage in 2014, a 3-year voyage, a circumnavigation. So hopefully from these examples, you get a sense of the cultural connection between people in Hawaii and their marine environment, and that maritime practices and beliefs continue, and they have significant cultural meaning and even possibly a kind of genealogical connection between people in Hawaii and species and environment. The second place I'll briefly mention is American Samoa. The Samoan Islands were originally discovered and settled more than 3,000 years ago as part of the original Austronesian expansion eastward into the Pacific. So there is an even longer history of ocean connection there. In the ensuing millennia that followed, descendants established and maintained a common culture and way of life known as Fa'a Samoa, the Samoan way. And one of the expressions of that heritage is the making and giving of fine mats. It's not about this fine mats per se, though, and that is obviously an object of traditional heritage. It's about the ceremonial giving of them, from whom to whom, in ceremony, maintaining the cultural identity of Samoan people and Fa'a Samoa in the islands. In Samoa, the two key units of social organization are the ainga, or extended family and clan, and the nu'u, or village. And at the core of family and village organization are the chiefly titles and rights to land use. And this social hierarchy is maintained through these practices. And that means that land use and the marine environment are part of the practice of Fa'a Samoa. So an example of intangible cultural heritage in Samoa would be, a selected example would be what we're calling now geocultural coastal features. There are a great number of legends and stories represented by natural features or specific locations within the coastal and marine context. The Samoan word tupua can refer to special rocks or formations that represent ancient humans. And specific locations, even underwater, such as fresh water springs or passages in the reef, can be associated with ancient events and legend. So in a very pragmatic manner, the features of the landscape and the seascape themselves are visible touchstones of this oral history, parts of the heritage record. This is Turtle and Shark Cove on the National Registry in American Samoa, a place associated with a legend of, a woman and child who, suffering famine in Savi'i, jumped into the ocean and swam to Tutuila, where they were taken in and well treated. And so today, if you go to this location and sing the appropriate song and chant, the turtle and the shark, the embodiment of this woman and child will swim into the cove. The second example of intangible culture I want to mention for American Samoa is fautasi racing. And some people today know this fautasi as the sleek longboats featured in the Flag Day races. But in truth, they are much more than just fast racing vessels or just a competition. Fautasi are a part of the history of Samoa, and more than that, a part of the cultural landscape there as well. Historically, fautasi evolved during the mid-19th century from Samoan and Western hybrids, such as this Taumualua, this two bows, this outriggerless Samoan vessel of considerable length and capacity, obviously. And the fautasi boats over time then filled many uses as they developed with the sweeps, many roles, but eventually transportation fell by the wayside, replaced by motor vessels. Use in warfare fell by the wayside, but racing became the sole occupation for these longboats, these fautasi in the islands. And today, the annual fautasi race is part of the largest cultural event in American Samoa. And beyond the construction of the boats themselves, the months of training and the village support required for the prestige and reward from the races make these races central to the spirit and morale and even the health of the community. So this is a history and a form and a practice from the past in action today. And that's central to the message of intangible cultural heritage, the active past in the present. This is a part of the cultural identity of American Samoans. And we focused on this at the inaugural Fautasi Heritage Symposium in 2019 in an effort to preserve this cultural heritage and tradition, this activity. So what does this all mean for the management that some of us are used to doing for underwater cultural heritage? Well, this is a challenge. Admittedly, you know, in our familiar paradigm of heritage preservation, we are experts at assessing and managing things, and often not expert at assessing and managing or protecting knowledge systems or traditional practices, the intangible cultural heritage, etc. Here is a GIS map, familiar to many, the kinds of ways we inventory the submerged objects, the UCH resource itself in the Hawaiian Islands. In our federal office, we operate under the authority of the National Historic Preservation Act, which establishes the state historic preservation offices and our national register. And under that act, we assess and nominate historic properties. And you can see in these four main significance criteria, those associated with events or lives of significant persons or distinctive construction, or simply have enough information, that these are all very focused on the past, which is important, but not focused on the active past in the present, seemingly not inclusive of practices and traditions or intangible cultural heritage. Well, that's partially true for the main criteria, but here's the thing. This NHPA Act that is our authority includes specific locations that are culturally significant for all sorts of intangible values. And you can see those listed here, locations associated with traditional beliefs, locations where Native American religious practitioners have gone or are known to go to date to perform ceremonial activities, or locations where a community has traditionally carried out artistic, economic, and other cultural practices to maintain its identity. So this is a bit of a shell game then, a recognition of the active past in the present by protecting those locations of those practices and calling them historic properties. It's a bit of a proxy the way we engage intangible cultural heritage. An example of that are viewsheds. Viewsheds can be cultural properties. There was quite a significant case back in 2010 when the tribe in Nantucket claimed a viewshed of the rising sun as its cultural property, its heritage, and that affected the proposed offshore wind turbine project. Here's an example of the importance of viewshed. This happens to be a missing viewshed, a World War II gun emplacement in American Samoa. The significance of this feature is the view of the entrance to the harbor, which is no longer there. So viewsheds do matter to tangible objects and significance. And a more interesting example of how viewsheds can be complex, particularly for island societies. This is how we conducted analysis of cultural viewsheds in Hawaii based on the visual connections between selected cultural properties, locations of Madame Pele's mythical voyage to the islands, the volcano goddess, and those properties were selected and their viewsheds selected to other properties then. This is an example of considering intangible cultural heritage in response to proposed offshore wind turbine development. So we do have a long ways to go as a federal office to engage intangible cultural heritage and more effectively, clearly, but we have a roadmap. We have ways that we want to get there. And first of all, chiefly, to summarize the steps we need to take, is build long-term relationships with indigenous communities. We have a moral obligation to do a better job at engaging these communities and a legal responsibility to properly consult with sovereign tribal nations. on a government-to-government basis. And in fact, we as a federal office are often not the ones that should be defining or researching the intangible cultural heritage of indigenous stakeholders and communities. Communities should be doing that themselves. So that's step one. Step two, we can do a better job by advancing the maritime cultural landscape as an assessment tool. Landscapes were initially proposed by Westerdahl in the 1990s, and the landscape approach contributes to our understanding of marine spaces by offering comprehensive assessments, inclusive of both tangible and intangible aspects. And step three, we have refined and used the ecosystem services framework in our assessment of marine spaces. This comes from the 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Of course, this framework to describe benefits to communities. And a large part of that are the cultural ecosystem services. Now, when this was first rolled out, there was a fair amount of criticism about ecosystem services and cultural services not being as well understood, and the approach being a little too monetized and economic. But there are revisions, and we have, revised and redefined this approach for ourselves in some internal workshops, where we feel we do a better job with including non-monetary valuation, narrative, and multiple cultural perspectives, particularly in the discussion of system benefits like sense of place and heritage. So that's step three. And this is what that looks like. And I get excited about pictures like this, I know, because I'm kind of a management nerd. But this is resource preservation in action, a public meeting in Washington State discussing intangible heritage and values of the ecosystem. Is this more complex than just considering properties like shipwrecks? Of course it is. But the management of marine spaces probably should be a complex and challenging initiative. Sometimes we as federal managers run into topics that need to be preserved and protected, types of places, but we shouldn't even be the ones knowing about them. And the information is actually quite private to the tribe or treaty nation. And so that's challenging, and that demands a high deal of collaboration and partnership. So in conclusion, what can we as maritime archaeologists think about or consider as steps forward as members of ICOMOS? Well, I would suggest three things. One, recognize that tangible and intangible heritage is linked, per our definitions and per our guidance. And even for shipwrecks, there are intangible aspects of heritage that we sometimes forget about. Step two, consider the UNESCO definition of UCH. Does all traces of human existence having a cultural, historical, or archaeological character really mean that intangible cultural heritage is off the table for us? Does this hamper us too much in our understanding of the connection between the two? And step three, in any event, marine spaces that we often work in are almost always part of older cultural landscapes, known locations to earlier stewards, who are often still around, and therefore should be acknowledged as such. And you can think of the example of HMS Terror and Erebus, which were recently surveyed and were gifted to Canada and the Inuit and are now in care of the Inuit Heritage Trust. Such land acknowledgement or sea space acknowledgement is difficult, and it's more than just some mandatory verbiage at the beginning of an academic paper at a conference. Acknowledgement implies understanding of different cultural perspectives. Whose land when and where? Those are difficult questions to answer. But cultures change, and even though we do love the nautical resource, there are obviously deeper connections to these marine spaces than just shipwrecks. So I'll leave the folks with that about intangible cultural heritage, some thoughts, and say that the single lesson for today then is that ICH is the active past in the present. We all have it, we all do it to one extent or another. And we should be aware of places where intangible cultural heritage can be important as, if not more so than, the tangible archaeological resource. Thank you.
Yes, it was amazing presentation, Hans. Especially the last part was wonderful, and we created a very beautiful 3 question marks. Yeah, we have to think about them actually. I completely agree with you, by the way. We are always thinking on the subject, especially the first one. Chris, I guess we can have some questions for 3 minutes. We have still 3 minutes to answer the questions.
Yes, exactly. Any questions from the floor, from the viewers?
This will all be on the test.
Mark Andrea's got his hand raised.
Yes, hi, Hans. That was a brilliant talk. And I have one question with relations to, obviously from the perspective of the people that are implicated in Hawaii, the response must be quite positive, obviously, but also, what was, did you have any stories of the how they reacted to you when you came to or when Noah came in and acknowledged all of this intangible? It must be quite a recognition for them to see that happening.
Yeah, I think that it is welcome to, be seen as, trying to break away from the familiar model from the 60s and 70s of we're only interested in the historic shell, the historic property itself, and not much to engage with culture. That being said, it's quite a lesson to move this initiative forward in Hawaii, which is so complicated and which has such strong living cultural and intangible connections to the marine environment. It's welcome, and our steps that we've taken in our own guidance and policy has been under advisement and with the input of our fellow managers in Hawaii, Hawaiian scholars, Samoan cultural leaders, etc. We're trying to be inclusive. We are a public agency, and so we have to take on this challenge. It's a welcome approach here, definitely.
Thank you.
Hakan, is there still time?
1 minute we have.
I'd just like to thank Hans for reminding us of this alternative universe that should be embraced and brought within the work that we do. And I can see the challenges. But people often say, what is there to do because so much is happening? Well, it occurred to me that many of the places that have been, let's say, researched have failed to include intangible cultural heritage. And even if you were to go back on the projects that we've all been involved in and take into account the intangible nature of those sites and link those to the local communities, there would be enormous benefit in doing so. I was also reminded of your talk in terms of Jonathan Schaafman, who also reminded us of the connection or the lack of connection that the East African communities had with some of the shipwrecks that were engaged in, let's say, unsavory practices from the centuries that have gone before, and that they're not so meaningful in the way that we would interpret them. Let's say we, in terms of perhaps typically interpreted them, but are more deeply rooted in things that have happened to that particular community. And I think linking this to the capacity building that we're all involved, or many of us are involved in, is a very important component moving forward. Anthony, quickly, I think.
Sorry, I thought I'd probably missed my slot. So yeah, a quick question. I think ICH, especially as you've expressed it there, is a really important prism for looking at a lot of the things that are of interest in marine management and marine communities in global north as well. But in a UK context, where I think we've got plenty of examples, the connection to making that connection to indigenous interests becomes problematic because indigenous is an extremely loaded term in our context. So I just wondered if you might have some thoughts on perhaps broadening that, what kind of terminology we might use if we're talking more about traditional or something like that, but even that can be regarded as pejorative as well. So I just, how might we apply this in a range of contexts? Thank you.
Oh, I wholly agree. It's, you know, we are shaped by a federal mandate in the US with certain language and with certain legal responsibilities for sovereign treaty tribes and indigenous communities. And that's not always the case elsewhere. But we do struggle with that as well. I mean, our Maritime Heritage Program addresses heritage inclusive of, and you know, is this a good term? The non-indigenous? Am I non-indigenous? I was born in New Jersey. I live in Hawaii, you know. What about the rest of us? We have commercial fishermen who have a heritage and tradition and practice. And, you know, they are not native community or indigenous groups. And we're a public agency. So we don't have all the answers to the difficulties with this type of terminology. And you're correct to point it out, particularly like, you know, indigenous groups. What does that mean for other places in the world? This is a challenge.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. Again, it was a very nice presentation. Now we are going to start to our second speaker, Attila Todt. Attila is an archaeologist of Arpad Museum of Rakev, Hungary. As an underwater archaeologist, his main field of interest is the research of the inland
Visszahívlak,
waters.
most éppen előadást tartok.
Inland
Visszahívlak.
waters, especially the Danube River. He started underwater research in the early 2000s. It is a member of ICOMOS UCH and is active in civilian archaeology organizations in Hungary. Welcome, Attila.
Hello, thank you. I will try to share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we see perfectly.
Yes, but okay, it is working. Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to speak about Hungary, and thank you for your kind presentation. It's a huge topic, so I think I will try to share a lot of different kind of information with you, just have an impression what we have and discover which could be common with other countries and which is what is special for the Danube River. So starting with geography. On the left, you can see the map of Europe and in red, Hungary. You may see that well, in geographical sense, Europe extends on the east till the Ural and Ural Mountain and Volga River. So Hungary is between the Atlantic Ocean and this eastern border. We are in the center of Europe, in Central Europe. Politically, Hungary is more often placed in Central Eastern or East Central Europe. The principal river of this area, you can see on the right side, is the Danube. It's a huge river. It is a 2,850 kilometer long river. And the Danube River has a lot of tributaries. So it's not just one river, it's a river system. And it covers more than 800,000 square kilometers. And the population which is connected to this Danube River basin, is over 100 million person. Mostly the countries connected to the Danube River basin, I found two data. One data is 14 countries, the other is 19 states. Maybe the bigger is when you include the territory connected by the tributaries. So not just the Danube, but the small rivers. So it's a mosaic of cultures and peoples through the history. And as you see from the map that it comes from southern Germany, so it connects the Alpine region with lowlands in Hungary and down in Romania and Bulgaria to the Black Sea. So that's almost Mediterranean area. This area was always a crossroad from north to west, migrations across this land. Mediterranean cultures like the Romans and Ottoman Empire, Byzantine Empire try to extend this region, and of course it has a northern connection. So it is on the crossroad. Just have an impression about the Danube. It's a very wide river. In Hungary, it is between 500 to up to 800 meters wide. There is a current, and because it's a river, of course, the visibility is limited. I will show a picture. So this is not in the Danube. You might have seen a lot of beautiful blue pictures from colleagues working in the seas, with amphorae or shipwrecks and so on. In our rivers, we have currents, so we have sediments, floating sediments, and even during the summer, algae. And this is why the visibility is very small. This is one of the best pictures we ever made. And this is not in the Danube, this is the Drava River, which is a western tributary of the Danube. We are at 2 meters depth, and you may see that visibility here is around 60, 80 centimeters. But in average, in the Danube, it is between 40, 60 centimeters. In extremely good condition, you may find 1 meter, for example, during the winter when the sun is shining and the water is very low. It's not very often the case. So it affects how we work. To the geography, I have to add that, the Danube River is a very important channel of navigation. From the mid-19th century, there is an international committee, the Danube Commission, consisting of Danubian states from Russia to Germany. And this was made after the Crimean War between England, France, and Russia. And they guaranteed the free navigation on the Danube. It means that Hungary and other states on the Danube has the duty to make available the navigation. So in the middle of the Danube, there is a navigation channel, which is regularly dredged over more than 100 years. And there are very big ships, commercial ships coming through the channels from, for example, Netherlands and going to Russia or Ukraine. So let's turn to the historical background, because you might not know too much about Hungary. I must express that the Danube was ever a corridor for migrating people, a corridor for trade, for armies, and of course also for culture. It was sometimes a border, like in this picture you see the Roman period, the Roman imperial period, when the western part of Hungary, west of the Danube, was a Roman empire, and east and north there were barbarians. It's a very nice mosaic, because in west and south you see Mediterranean Romance, In the east, the Yazigians, who were an eastern type nomadic people. On the north, the Quads, who were Germanic barbarian tribe. So it shows the cultural complexity and of course political complexity of this area during the Roman times. And the Danube was not only just a water ditch. It was there was a system of fortresses and small watchtowers looking for the Danube, and of course some fortified ports for crossing the rivers for Roman merchants in peace or Roman armies during war. So there was a river infrastructure. We know only a fragment of this infrastructure and culture, unfortunately, because the river was not very well researched before. But if we go back to in time to prehistory, you may have heard about Gordon Childe, who was a big theorist of European and world prehistory in the 1920s and 30s. And he wrote a book in the 1920s, 1929 perhaps. The title is The Danube in Prehistory. And he made cultural horizons from Neolithic to Bronze Age, which he named Danubian I, Danubian II, and so on. So the concept that the Danube is a cultural phenomena goes back to the beginning of the 20th century archaeological research. To conclude this historical geography, we can conclude that the territory of Hungary was ever a crossroad, and the Danube and the tributaries were very important, but not only in military and political and economical aspect, but the water, it is drinking water, it is also energy, for example, for water mills, source of food, fishing, and of course, source of danger, flooding. And there was a sensitive relation between the rivers and the communities living on the riverbanks. And of course, the traces of this relationship could be found under the water. So let's see the history of research. In this slide, you can see a picture from the 80s, mid-80s, 1980s. At Bölcske, this is south of Budapest. Maybe I will go back. If you see the arrow, we are somewhere here. So this is modern Budapest. This is modern Belgrade in Serbia. Belgrade is here, Budapest is here, Vienna is here, and Bratislava is somewhere here. So we are in the center of Hungary, in the next slide. And there was a rock under the water, and when they managed the navigation channel, they discovered that there are ruins under the water. And in the mid-90s, local archaeologists, I have to mention Attila Gál and Géza Szabó from the local museum of Szexárd, who organized the first underwater archaeological research in Hungary. They worked with volunteers, they worked with military divers, because there was no archaeological organization in that time for underwater archaeology. And they discovered that there is a Roman site under the river, probably a fortified port. And the fortification, the basement of this fortification were made of huge limestone blocks. And when they moved these blocks, they discovered that these blocks were inscribed and sculptured Roman altars from the imperial period. It's a very important find, and they discovered that these stones came from the present-day Budapest ancient Aquincum, which is about approximately 150 kilometers upstream. So someone brought Roman stones from Aquincum and transported on the Danube in the Roman imperial period for the foundation of this military fortification. It was very important in that in the 80s. Even Jacques-Yves Cousteau visited the site. In the late 80s and 90s, the politics in Hungary changed very steep and strongly, because from the socialist bloc allied to the Soviet Union, it disappeared, and we changed the political system. It had effects in archaeology, of course. The old financial modes and cooperation channels didn't work anymore, so we had to wait to the 2000s to re-establish civilian organizations and cooperation between civilians and museums and archaeologists and sponsorships all had to build up. So the Hungarian Archaeological and Art Historical Association became the heart of this reformation. It's a very old civilian organization, and it was founded a new underwater archaeological branch still in the 1990s. In the 2000s, we found a very small civilian organization, an action group. It is called Argonaut Research Group, consisted of some archaeologists and very enthusiastic divers who help. It is for organizing research and collecting grants and funding for researches. Today, the organizational background out of this civilian part is my museum, the Arpad Museum. It is situated in Ráckeve. It's a territorial museum south of Budapest. You have to know that on the Danube there are islands, and there is a very big island south of Budapest. It is called Chapel Island, and Ráckeve, the city of my museum, is just situated on this island. So we are islanders. And we had a lot of Danube around the island, of course, and we made a lot of cooperation agreements with other museums in Hungary and research institutions. So we have the right to go to the territory of other museums in cooperation and carry out researches. What kind of researches? Most of our researches are topographical, because I think the most important in the protection of underwater cultural heritage to detect where is the heritage, and deeper scientific research can just follow this step. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, fortunately, we have a lot of waters, a lot of rivers and lakes, so we have a lot of heritage. Unfortunately, we don't have enough sources to carry out all these researches. So I calculate that the basic topography requires 100 years at least with this speed that we have. From the point of view of research history, I have to mention one European project. This was carried out in 2004-2005. It was called the European Fluvial Heritage. It consisted of France, Slovenia, and Hungary. Annie Dumont from France, some of you may know her. She's very important in river archaeology in France. And Slovenia, Andrej Gaspari, who is a member of the ICOMOS too. And me from Hungary, we carried out some researches in both countries. It was very important because we had the chance to learn methodology from each other, develop methodology, and train some divers and archaeologists to help us in underwater archaeology. Another very important site is Drava Tamási. The Drava River is in south of Hungary. This is the national border between Croatia and Hungary, and it flows to the Danube River. It comes from Austria, Slovenia, and even the source of the Drava is in Italy, North Italy. So it's a very international river. And there we had logboats, but not just a few logboats, a lot of logboats in one side. And you may see the archive pictures up. These logs are logboats. You may see 4 of them, but under the water on the sonar image below, you may see these sticks on the sonar image. It's a very large area. It's 500 meters long. So these sticks are very big. These are all logboats. These logboats are between 10 to 30-meter logs long, so they are very big logs. And we counted 31 together. The majority is on the Hungarian side of the Drava, but some of them are on the Croatian side. And this is why we started international cooperation. It lasted for 3 years. And we invited French, Austrian, Cyril Dvorsky, maybe you know him, and Croatian researchers like Krunoslav Zubčić and even Mario Jurisic visited us in one of our campaigns. But students, at that time, students came to work with us from Northern Ireland, and even Serkan Gündüz, who is joined to this meeting from Turkey, visited us as a student. So it was a very international research, and we very liked this kind of work. So in the next part, I would like to share you some case studies. I can't speak about everything, so I choose some special and interesting researches. Sheep mills. I don't know how, what do you know about sheep mills? Sheep mill is a special kind of mill because it is a floating mill. There is a big ship. This ship mill is in Ráckeve, in my museum town. It's a replica, a reconstruction, but based on an original ship mill, the last ship mill of this town. And the internal parts, the irons especially, are conserved by local miller families and donated to the foundation when they started to reconstruct this mill. So the internal part is original and the ship is a replica. So you see here a big ship, a small ship, and between the two there are deep timbers, and you may see these paddle wheels. Originally, these ship mills were fixed with anchor or a big wooden post on the river in the current, and as they were stopped, the paddle wheels were moved by the water, and in the big ship there inside, there was the milling machine. In earlier time, it was a stone, a millstone. Later, like in this ship, it is an iron milling system. Why it is interesting? It is important because up to the 19th century, sheep mills were a very familiar part of the Hungarian countryside. If you go to the Danube, any part in a historical period, you might see sheep mills everywhere. In the map on the left side, you may see a small section, I mean 2 kilometers by 4 kilometers section of the Danube. And there is a small tributaries. This is the frontier, present-day frontier between up is Slovakia, south is Hungary. And you may see a lot of points, rows of points. And these points are wooden piles, marking wooden piles. And each wooden piles belonged to one sheep mill. So at this location, because in this location the current was especially suitable for milling, they planted at least 24 active sheep mills in a certain period. But in every village there were 1, 2, 3 sheep mills, and in bigger places like towns, even dozens, and they called them sheep mill villages. In the archive photo in the right, it's from the very beginning of the 20th century. You might see Mohács is in South Hungary. You can see sheep mills and even a traditional plank-built ship together. If it would be a bigger picture, you might see a steamship too. So it was a very familiar view of the Danubian landscape. And the big question is, okay, we know a lot of things about 19th century. Even we have good maps for the 18th century. But what about the origin? Evlia Celebi, who was a Turkish traveler. You have to know that in the 15th, late 15th, 16th and 17th century, there was a big war between the Hungarian kingdom and the Ottoman Empire, and the central part of the Hungarian kingdom, including Buda, the present-day Budapest, the capital, was conquered by the Ottomans. And Evliya Çelebi, who was a Turkish traveler in the 17th century, around 1660, he visited Hungary during a military campaign, and he described the Danubian part of Hungary. And he mentioned that the Hungarians had beautiful sheep mills. He never seen such a well-built and beautiful sheep mills as the Hungarians have. But this is the description. We don't know why these sheep mills were very well built and beautiful, and what is the difference between a Hungarian sheep mill and a German sheep mill, or a Bulgarian sheep mill, or an Italian sheep mill. The origin of sheep mills goes back to the later Roman Empire, at least. But the earliest source and earliest artifacts from Hungary is going back only to the 14th century. So the earliest actual sheep mill wreck we identified is from the 14th century. We have no, and the first written source connected to sheep mill in Hungary is 14th century. So we don't know what happened between the later Roman Empire and this medieval period, and what is the relation of this medieval sheep mills and the early modern sheep mills. This is a big question, and not only for Hungary, because the sheep mills are heritage in all European rivers. And when we found recently, the recent 5 years, 3 of them, the earliest from the 14th century, and then came another one. It is from Százhalombatta from the 16th century. You see in the orthophoto. And the specialty of this early sheep mills is the extended monoxyle technology, which means that the edge of the sheep, so the floor planking, the meeting of the floor planking and the side planking is made of a single log, a single piece of wood, like a log boat. It is L-shaped, and they attach big oak plank between these monoxyle elements, and they built a big box like this. And the pro is has a V form in this kind of sheep mill. You may see the holes. These are for 3 nails. And extended monoxyle technology is not a novelty. So it's archaism, because we know extended monoxyle technology from Roman Empire, like from Roman ships from Lyon or Zwammerdam-type ships in the Netherlands. And it is well documented in Europe in the medieval period. I mean, from the 10th to 13th century AD, from France, Germany, Switzerland, and even Poland. So there is nothing special that we found an early 14th century extended monoxyle sheep mill in Hungary, but from the 16th century, it is very late. And from Ordas, this is South Hungary, we found this piece at a very low water level. And this is a very intact sheep mill, because it was protected. Well, they didn't want to protect it because during the river regulation, they throw a lot of stone blocks on the river bank, and there was a ship under the water, so it was covered by this block, but these blocks conserve the ship. And this turned out that this is 19th century, and the technology is very archaic. This is an extended monoxyle shipwreck, but the shape and the proportions are identical to the earlier ship mills. So we see a very interesting phenomena that ship mills are like the product of local shipbuilding, because there were a lot of ship mills. So it is evident that they built locally the ship mills and repair them locally. So there are imprints of local shipbuilders, and the continuation of this old technology shows that there was a continuation of shipbuilding heritage in Hungary from the earlier medieval up to early modern period. And this is a novelty because we didn't know anything about this continuity before. And even so, it was thought that the Ottoman rule and the destruction of the country and the resettlement of foreigner people in abandoned Danubian lands bring new technologies to shipbuilding. But no, these ships, the ship mills show us that there was a continuity. So it's very important. Just, I would like to mention some other projects in the level of mentioning because we have no time, but conflict archaeology. Muhi is a very small village in Hungary today, and there was a huge battle in 1241 between the Hungarian kingdom and the Mongolian army. And the Mongolians defeated the Hungarian king and conquered very rapidly the kingdom. They left the territory one year later, but during this year they killed, according to literary sources and modern calculation, the 50% of the population of the Hungarian kingdom was killed in this year. So it was a disaster, very important battle. But what we know about the battle, because there were not too much survivors, that there was a bridge in the center of this battle. And to find where was the bridge is a key element. But from modern research, we know that the river, it's a small stream, river environment changed a lot. So we have to look for all wooden piles, all artifacts in the rivers to identify where is the bridge and actually where was the battle. Lake Balaton, it's a very big lake in Hungary, but very shallow. It's a touristic lake. People are coming for swimming and surfing and drinking wine and fishing and so on. But we didn't know what is under the water. And recent researches show us that there are, for example, submerged lands under the water. So the water level of the Balaton changed throughout the time. And this led us to the climate changes, which is a completely new research area, and this connects us to Doggerland and a lot of other projects. So inland waters, you can find similar features like in the seas. Of course, environment is different. And the good news that in sweet water, I mean river water and lake water, the perishable materials like wood and skin could survive for multi-millennia, like from the Swiss Bronze Age lakes, you know. So maybe from Balaton, from the Danube, we might have similar, very important artifacts in the future. Thank you very much, and I will try to answer.
It's perfectly on time, Attila. Thank you very much, and your presentation is also excellent. Now we have 2 minutes for the questions to Attila.
Marc-André's hands up, Attila. Marc-André?
Yes, excellent presentation, Attila. Thank you. I'm amazed by the mill ships. But my question is more on the logboats, 31 of them. That's spectacular. Why do you think they all, that we see this graveyard of boats? Do you have interpretation on that?
Yes, I forgot because I tried to speak too much about too much sites. So the hypothesis, and I think it's approved, it was a pontoon bridge, a floating bridge, a military bridge, because we have written sources for the exact period, because we have Ottoman period material under the water. We found, for example, a copper cauldron, even a school. We don't know it's Ottoman or Hungarian, but we have written sources that in the early 17th century, there was a military bridge of the Ottoman Empire, and there was a Hungarian raid, like a commando raid, attacking this bridge, and they destroyed a bridge at this location and killed the army stationed there. So it's a very plausible explanation that it was a floating bridge, and the Ottomans collected all floating objects on the river. And this land was very famous for very big oak trees. So it is not a big surprise that they use. And in Hungary, the big change is the 18th century, when they cut, 18th, 19th centuries, they cut the big oak forests, and it became meadows and cultivated fields.
Oh, very good. Did you do dendrochronology on them, or yeah?
Yes, we have a dendrochronologist, and we have a local chronology or chronologies. In some period, like Roman period and early Arpadian, I mean 12th, 13th century, we can connect it to German chronology, but in other periods we have different. It's climatic question, the woods, and there might be different regions with different chronologies. The problem is going back in time. So early medieval, Roman period, Bronze Age, we have a fragment of chronologies, but we are not able to connect them each other. But underwater archaeology is very good for this reason, because we can collect wood for colleagues, and this is not only for dendrochronology, this is good for climate research too.
Great. Well, thank you, and very impressive work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other question, and this is the end of the ICOMOS webinar, and it was really great to have these two important, valuable presentations from Hans and Attila. Chris, would you like to say something?
Thank you, Hakan, and thank you very much, Attila. Both our presenters, I think, presented aspects that are not so familiar, certainly with myself and many of us who are marine-based maritime archaeologists. I think Attila exemplified the enormous potential of these huge European and other continental river systems in exploring every avenue of cultural heritage. I benefited from reading Attila's contribution to our Heritage at Risk publication, which I think refocused my attention on what was happening on these river systems. It's absolutely fascinating.
Just a small addendum.
Yes.
Rivers could be very different. So we are in temperate climate and in Europe. It means that the Danube is very clean now, because to recent efforts, it's very clean. Not drinking water, but almost. In the middle of the Balaton, you can drink. There are no dangerous animals, no dangerous insects or bacteria and so on. So we are very, very lucky in this way. Maybe in other countries, for example, in the tropical belt, it is much more difficult. So researching the Nile, or even Amazonas, which could have some potential, that could be extremely different. So this is a temperate climate river archaeology.
Thanks, Attila, for that addendum. Of course, completely agree, and things are more difficult where we are here in Latin America, and the Amazon and the river systems, a bit more complicated. But nonetheless, I think what you exemplify is the range and depth of cultural material, and I think Hans also, just to bring Hans into this picture, has reminded us that it's not just about tangible but intangible heritage as well. Enormous scope, and thank you very much to both speakers.
Thank you again, and we wish to see you all at the 10th ICOMOS UCH webinar next month, and have a great day, have a great evening, have a great night. Goodbye.
And thank you, Hakan, for organizing it. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you for attending.